before the interests of family. And there is that huge sense of bonding. And then, as you said, we've now emerged into an era of, exploring new identities, new meanings. But the sense of bonding and belonging, it always seems to me, is still very strong. And so you don't get rid of a Catholic habitus within, one generation, 2 generations. But in fact, I can see it in I use the term, following Swidler, of cultural strategies that people use. Now, a lot of the cultural strategies that we use in Ireland are Catholic strategies of presenting ourselves and talking about ourselves, of self-deprecation, of putting ourselves down before people take the piss out of you. All of those are learned, and the sense of humour and the sense of presenting ourselves, again, at a level of Goffman level of interaction. I think it's right. That's why, people still say, God, I love Ireland, I love the people, I love the crack, I love the sense of humour, I love the way you guys get together. And I say, well, they do that. No, it's just a peculiar Irish way, and I think it's right. It's a long-term cultural process of change.
And would you be a little bit concerned about the directions, that the direction is somehow, escaping the moral monopoly, but out of the what is it, the pot of moral monopoly and into the fire of, liberal individualism?
It's been a theme this morning and this afternoon about, and I haven't gone into that, but I would not be as pessimistic about from my study. I might have been pessimistic myself before I did the study, but if you like, if it is that case, then the ability, the enduring ability of people to make a heaven out of hell, and I've been traveling for the last good few months, but I was recently in India, and again it's that kind of typical, stereotypical scene of seeing absolutely immiserated Indian kids laughing and screaming and running around, having nothing, but at the same time, seeming to be happy, etc., etc. So it's the conditions of their existence, absolutely, but their ability to create meaning, to create happiness, to create bonds within that. I think that's all I'm saying, is that sociologists need perhaps to look at that.
I think one of the very interesting findings you had was you mentioned that you found that the participants in your study, they weren't ideological.
No.
And and that kind of made me think again about kind of developing my hypothesis here about what your work is saying, because if you think about the heritage of the kind of Catholic Church, you're speaking about this kind of inheritance of I guess we're not of kind of denial and humbleness and not promoting yourself, and kind of, do you think the Catholic Church had an effect of blocking? James gave a very good presentation earlier on today about Gnosticism, which is these kind of, we're living these ideological fantasy worlds, which can be quite a destructive form of thinking. And I got the impression from your work that people, as you said, they're not ideological, they're actually living within concrete locations and concrete relationships. And do you think the Catholic Church had a role in actually stifling this kind of negative developments?
One of the things is that people live with contradictions. They don't try to develop a cohesive explanation of the meaning of their life. They are selective. So people will believe in salvation and heaven and God, and then say, sure, maybe there's reincarnation. Sure, you never know. So they're able to live with ambiguity, contradiction, and fuzziness. And so therefore, one of the things of that is organizations have to be goal-directed and ideological, but families, I think, work differently. They work on a fuzziness, but the goal is staying together, of bonding and belonging, and they use culture as a means of doing that. And it's for me, it's just the culture that most of these, particularly the middle-aged and older people use, was they used, what I might call, I call them creative Catholics or cultural Catholics. But but they're not worried about dogma. They're not worried anymore about, hell. They're not worried about following the teachings and rules and regulations of the Catholic Church. But they use the Church as a means towards an end. And the end is not salvation. They have absolutely, what happens when you die, I used to ask. Geez, that's a good one. And when I interviewed a priest, and I asked him, do you believe in heaven? I said, maybe this is not exactly right. And he said, sure, I suppose in my line of business you'd have to.
Still do Memoir.
Yeah, and that literally, but he wouldn't be pushing it. He saw his work as being pastoral, of looking after people who are ill, sick or dying, and looking after them, and not pushing any ideological line.
Yeah, that's where you, in your book, like Are the Irish Different, you draw on Richard Carney and his argument that there actually is something specifically different about the Irish mentality, which is based on, this kind of happiness with contradictions and not really kind of like a Kantian form of thought.
Yeah, I've kind of explored that, but I remember one time, I don't want to be culturally specific, but with this guy, he turned out to be German, but he said to me, I wish you Irish would be consistent. And I said, but where would consistency get us? But it's the idea that you have a position about life, you have a rationale, and you're able to explain yourself, and you're able to live that as a set of moral principles, again Kantian, that you're able to, be that. I have devised my own ethic of individual moral responsibility, and I live by that code. Whereas the Irish are much more flexible, dynamic. This is Richard Carney's, adaptable, transposable, and actually you make it up as you go along. But that makes you flexible, transposable, dynamic, and adaptable because you don't have any, rigid. So therefore, he says that what companies were attracted to coming to Ireland, the IDA, used his bylines as a means of getting, American or other transnational corporations to come into Ireland because the workforce were not dogmatic about how they should live their lives or about inflexibility and not being open to change.
I'm sorry for leading you away from the meanings of life there, but
That's okay.
When you're writing that book, the one thing that you make a comment about the role of the sociologist, I think, kind of the public role of the sociologist in that, because I think the message in your book, it's a very important message. And at one point, I think, don't attack me if I'm wrong about this, but I think you make the association that sociology could actually play a role similar to religion in contemporary culture by, I guess kind of articulating people's experiences and illuminating, offering a language to illuminate people's experiences for them. Do you think you actually see kind of possibly a passing of the torch from the church to the sociologists?
Okay, that comes back to which I used to always say to the students is I've always really spent most of what I've been writing and researching about and teaching is about how I came to be the way I am. But very shortly, when I realized that it wasn't about, I had to understand how the culture in which I was enmeshed came to be the way it was. And again, as much as going out and interviewing people, realizing that I am a part of a species being, a cultural species being, and that I'm irrelevant insofar as that to understand me, if you did a good socio-historical, sociological analysis, you say, voila, here's Tom. And there are hundreds and thousands of other Toms in Ireland, and they think and act, much the same way as if you found a monkey, you'd be able to find out about the rest of the monkeys by looking at one monkey. Now that's, again, an argument which is what I was told when I was studying, we can never generalize from the particular, was something I was, drummed into me by the positive empiricists who taught me. And now I've moved towards being much more autobiographical and putting myself into the structures and the conditions of my existence. But maybe we can come back to that at some other stage.
Yeah, okay. I suppose, what would I like to talk about? I suppose maybe we could move on a bit to kind of the craft of sociology now. I mean, we've kind of a big audience here of people in the course of their PhDs, and they're involved in writing, and you've had, a very good output in your career. Actually, I had kind of one kind of nonsense question which I wanted to ask you, which was your attraction to the font Courier, I think. What is it about Courier that's so fascinating? Or not
laziness.
Laziness.
Okay, I moved on to Times New Roman, so don't. That was the one standard bearer about 20 years ago, and I, being a traditionalist didn't change.
Okay, but
that was a nonsense question.
Yeah.
But maybe that's the kind of Michael Parkinson. Throw in an odd grenade and see how it reacts.
What about wingdings? That could be a solution. But just about your about your kind of practice of writing. I mean, do you have any? Could you talk a little bit about your craft of producing sociological work?
As I said, I've always tried to understand how I came to be the way I am, and I suppose. It is that balance between reading theory and doing empirical work. So now, the empirical work in the 70s that I grew up with was doing social surveys and positive empirical number crunching, and I was a number cruncher for years, and I had an epiphany, which was I realized power. I remember where it was, but I can't remember when it was. But and we talked about this. In the 70s, it was all in UCD. It was all social survey, and you did social surveys as a sociologist, as a social scientist, in order to improve social policy. So it was about creating the good Catholic society by gathering information in order to improve social services. Trinity started to read Marxism, and they got in John Jackson and then Brian Terode and James Wickham, and these were English Marxists. So it became quite an attractive thing to go into their seminars. But then I realized that, yes, power was the right answer, but they weren't explaining anything about the power of the Catholic Church. So I was working as the research officer for the Catholic Church at the time, and I had this kind of Pauline conversion and realized that this was an institution of power, an organization of power, and that it wasn't about, it may have been about saving souls, but it was about them staying in business, which is still the case. And then when it was the Marxists had no interest in ideology, and they certainly no interest in religion, and certainly no interest in the Catholic Church, but to write about power and not to make any reference to the Catholic Church was thinking inside a theoretical box and saying, here is the total, the explanation, and so everything can be explained. So I've always tried to be, and that's why even when I was deeply committed to Bourdieu, it took me a while to realize that he never explained. Habitus was a great concept, but never explained how it worked. He never did any of that nitty-gritty empirical ethnography work to show how habitus is transmitted, how it's maintained in families, in schools. So it's always, for me, it's a balance between theories and concepts are practical instruments for explaining what's going on empirically in everyday life, but don't use the same concept, don't use the same theory, and don't think that, most of all, that one theory explains all. And Marxism in the 70s was that, definitely. And it was brutally ideological.
And, you know, the thing about your work is that, you know, well, I guess, you know, it's thinking outside of theoretical boxes, but also it's like, you know, your kind of sense of personal commitment to an issue. And it seems from your work, you write a lot about kind of the mode of sociology, about attempting to somehow assist in, you know, overcoming symbolic domination of subordinated groups as a commitment of the sociologist as well. So there's kind of an ethical side as well as a theoretical side to the work that we do.
It is, and it's, you know, for many men like myself growing up in the 70s, because I worked in adult education I was out in the wilderness for 5 years working in adult education, and while I was there I was working with women, and I was working with disadvantaged women in working class areas. Now it seemed odd, like me, middle class, you know, well educated, going out and sitting with these women in primary schools around working class Dublin, you know, teaching them about empowerment and emancipation. But I learned that again that the task for men was to think or to try and realize the way that they symbolically dominate women and how they can be symbolically violent to women. And so Bourdieu talked about, you know, the symbolic violence of middle class culture, particularly in schools. But it was also then about working with these women that I began to realize, and he does talk about it in Pascalian Meditations, but it is about trying to get beyond, you know, the ethnocentric habitus into which you've been socialized. And how can you do that? I mean, so one of the questions I was writing was, you know, what was I do? Can a man say anything relevant or meaningful to an oppressed, dominated woman living in a working class area in Dublin? Am I not making her situation worse, you know, by adding to the symbolic domination? And what can I do? So then it is how, you know, to go back to the question, which is, you know, can sociology become a force of empowerment and emancipation more, that allows you to think through and beyond the ideologies in which you are enmeshed, but also then the methods and theories in which you are enmeshed. And that goes back to this idea of, you know, I was told never to generalize from the particular. And when I was doing this, that's the second edition of Moral Monopoly, when I deliberately began that book autobiographically. And it was, the reason why it was deliberate was because in order to develop a hermeneutical understanding of the culture, it's not, anthropology says you have to leave it and go and study and immerse yourself in another culture. My thing is, no, you can do it in your own culture, but you do need to be sensitive, aware, and to be continually critically self-reflective of the means by which you're trying to write about yourself and how relevant and meaningful it is in doing that. So, yes, I have encouraged PhD students to be more autobiographical. And funnily enough, there is a, if you like, if it's not a linguistic turn, there is a turn in sociology where externs are no longer going and saying, Jesus, there was an awful lot. And then they're saying, God, that most interesting bit was when you wrote about your dad. And, you know, I had one student whose dad had been incarcerated in an industrial reformatory school. And she had done interviews with inmates. But she wrote about her own personal experience of growing up with a father who had been an inmate. and what it was to live with somebody who'd been so traumatized by that experience. And I said, well, who else is going to write about that? I mean, that's a part of the story. But if you don't write about it, who else will? And she did, and of course the extern, liked it.
Because if you're in a culture which is, if you have respondents saying things, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And and sure, and there's actually nothing kind of explicitly being said. So in a way, like the insider is more sensitive to these like things that actually aren't articulated. It's like it's like the idea of Franz Boas that you have to do your research in a language that's different than yours. But I mean, if you're in a culture where people essentially kind of don't say very much, or they say things that are really kind of empty, it's really empty language. It's there can be something to be very much recommended about that. Some very striking passages in your work where you're actually reflecting on your own experiences. Like Moral Monopoly begins very powerfully, where you begin talking about your own childhood as the experience of being a Catholic and kind of that time period.
Well, there was two reasons. One was if like a sociological turn about including myself. But when Moral Monopoly, the first edition came out in 1987, and the church was still enormously powerful, and it was rubbished by the church. I mean, and they started putting out stories about I believe there's problems in the family. God love him, he's a decent enough character, but chip in the shoulder, and there was that personal kind of thing. I think he was interested in the people. I don't think it followed through. And I worked with these guys. And I know exactly what their strategy was. So I wanted to kind of say to the reader, look, I'm as bona fide, a Catholic upbringing as any of you, of those Catholic readers. And so it was about also establishing my credentials, that I'm not this abstract generalist sociologist who has come in and doesn't know. Because Mary Kenny described it as a sustained, bitter, an attack on an institution which we all love. I said, Jesus, wow.